Every night Lucia cleaned the rooms of a hotel she could never afford to stay in, and with the little she earned, she kept her sick mother alive. Her boss had her watched, convinced she was stealing, but the night he followed her home, he discovered that his own family had quietly destroyed her life. That night, Alexander Vidal made the biggest mistake of his life. It was not a grand decision. It was not a signature on a contract or a directive announced in a boardroom. It was something far simpler and far more irreversible. He decided to follow a woman who did not know she was being followed all the way to a house he never should have seen. And what he found inside that house destroyed him in a way that no amount of business success had ever prepared him for. But that night had not arrived yet. First came the phone call. It was 7:15 in the morning when Gloria Mendez, head of housekeeping at the Hotel Vidal Imperial, dialed her boss's direct line with a voice that was trying very hard to sound neutral and not quite succeeding.
"Mr. Vidal," she said, "I need to speak with you about something sensitive, about an employee on the 22nd floor." Alexander Vidal was 32 years old.
He had the most recognized name in the regional hospitality industry and the habit of resolving problems before anyone finished explaining them. He was the owner of the Vidal Group, a chain of 5 hotels his father, Arthur Vidal, had built from nothing, and that Alexander had multiplied with a strategic coldness his competitors admired in public and feared in private. He was the kind of man who never needed to raise his voice because his silence already said enough. "Go ahead," he said without looking up from the report in front of him.
"It is Lucia Paredes, sir. She has been leaving with bags she should not be taking. Items from storage, minibar products, extra towels, nothing outrageous all at once. But the numbers do not lie, and it always lines up with her shift."
Alexander turned slightly in his chair. Outside the city was already wide awake, and he had not yet had his first cup of coffee. "How long have you been noticing this?" "Almost a month, sir." "Why did you not tell me sooner?" There was a brief but honest pause. "Because Lucia is the best employee I have on that floor, Mr. Vidal. I wanted to be certain before I said anything. I did not want to be wrong about her." That stopped him for a moment. The best employee I have on that floor. Not exactly the description that usually preceded an accusation of theft. But numbers did not lie, and neither did Gloria. "Put her under observation. Do not confront her. Give me a week." He hung up and sat staring at the report he could no longer read. The days that followed had that particular tension that exists when someone watches without being seen. Gloria sent reports every 2 days. Nothing explosive, nothing definitive, but the patterns persisted with the quiet stubbornness of things that are true. Lucia left with bags. Lucia lingered longer than necessary near the storage room. Lucia always punctual, always efficient, always invisible in the way that good employees learn to be. She was doing something she should not have been doing, or so it seemed. On the 5th day, Alexander made the decision his advisors would have counseled against. He would go himself, not because it was necessary. He had people for that. He had protocols. He had security. He had an entire system designed for exactly these situations. But something in him, something he could not name in that moment, needed to see with his own eyes where that woman went when she left the hotel. He needed to understand it, not just know it. That small difference in intention would be the one that changed everything. Lucia Paredes came out through the service entrance at 8:16 in the evening. Alexander watched from his car, parked far enough away not to be noticed. She appeared still in her uniform, carrying a canvas tote bag pressed against her side, with the posture of someone who carries heavy things and has learned not to show it. She walked straight to the bus stop without looking side to side, without the tired shuffle of someone clocking out and switching off. She walked like someone who had somewhere urgent to be, like someone with a real, quiet purpose. The bus arrived. Alexander followed in his car.
The city changed outside his window in a way Alexander knew in theory, but had never experienced up close.
The upscale neighborhoods gave way to the functional ones. The functional ones gave way to the humble, and the humble gave way to something that no longer had a polite name. Unpaved streets, poles without working lights, houses built with whatever was available at the moment they were needed, with no plan beyond surviving the next month. Lucia got off at an unmarked stop and disappeared down a narrow alley. Alexander parked and followed on foot. He walked through streets his shoes had never touched before, feeling something that was not quite fear but resembled it. Something closer to the physical discomfort of being in a place that reminded him how much larger and harder the world was than his daily life allowed him to see. The house was at the end of a block that could not quite decide if it was a street or a vacant lot. It was a small, unfinished concrete block with a sheet metal roof, propped up in one corner by a wooden post. The door was metal, with a brand-new deadbolt that clashed with everything around it, as if it were the only thing Lucia had been able to buy new in a very long time. A single window glowed with light from inside. Lucia pulled out her key, unlocked the door, stepped inside. And Alexander, moved by an instinct he could not have justified to anyone, walked up close and stood beside that window. "I am home, Mama."
Lucia's voice from inside was completely different from the one she used at the hotel. Softer, more real. The voice of someone arriving somewhere where she did not have to pretend anything. The response came after a few seconds.
A voice that was fragile, carrying that tremor that is not fear, but the accumulated exhaustion of a body that no longer responds the way it once did. "My baby girl. Did you eat anything? I ate at work. Do not worry." "That is a lie," said the older voice with a tenderness that passed right through the walls. "You always say the same thing and you always arrive hungry. I have known you since the day you were born, Lucia." Alexander leaned close to the gap between the window frame and the plastic covering. What he saw took him a moment to process. In a small bed pressed against the far wall lay an older woman, white hair, hands resting on the blanket, with the stillness of someone who has learned to move as little as possible because every movement costs something. Her eyes, though, were alive, dark and alert, with an intelligence intact that sometimes remains when the body no longer keeps up. Lucia was kneeling beside the bed, holding her mother's hands. She examined her arms with a practiced, methodical gentleness, like someone who has learned to be a nurse without anyone teaching her. She adjusted the pillow, touched her mother's forehead, and then opened the bag. It was not money. It was not anything she could sell. She pulled out a small bottle of moisturizing lotion from a sweet minibar, a hand soap from the premium bathroom amenities, 2 small towels, and at the bottom, handled with something close to reverence, a bottle of antiseptic solution from the 22nd floor supply closet. She arranged them on the bedside table, took the antiseptic, poured a little onto a cotton ball, and began gently cleaning a small wound on her mother's arm at the site of a poorly healed IV access point. Rosa closed her eyes. Not in pain, in relief. "That is it," she murmured. "Your hands always know what to do." Alexander felt something break inside him without making a sound. She was not stealing to sell anything. She was stealing to heal someone. It was then that a teenage boy came through an interior door, carrying a small pot, with an expression far too serious for 16 years old. Tall, lean, with the same dark eyes as his mother, and the way of moving that belongs to someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. "The soup is ready, Mom." "Thank you, baby. Did you finish your homework?" "Almost." "Almost is not finished." "Yeah, almost is almost. he said with a half a smile that lasted exactly 1 second before turning serious again. How is Grandma?
The same,
said Lucia, and in those 2 words there was a weight no teenager should have to carry, a weight that the boy bore without flinching, like someone who already understands what it means and has decided to stay standing anyway. He walked over and kissed his grandmother on the forehead. Good night, Grandma. Rosa took his hand and squeezed it with the strength that remains when there's not much left. Look after your mama, she said very quietly. She does not look after herself. The boy looked at Lucia. Lucia looked away. Alexander stepped back from the window. He walked to his car with his hands in his pockets and his head slightly down, like a man who has just taken a hit he did not see coming. He sat behind the wheel, leaned his arms against it, and stayed there in silence, while the city outside continued its usual noise, completely unaware that inside that car, a 32-year-old man was quietly dismantling something he had spent a lifetime building. All week he had assembled in his mind the image of a dishonest employee, a woman who exploited her position, who took advantage of the trust she had been given. He had built that image from data, from patterns, from the cold logic of an executive who knows how to read numbers, and the image was technically accurate. Lucia was taking things from the hotel, but the conclusion he had drawn was completely, devastatingly wrong. He thought about his father, about Arthur Vidal, the man who had built the Vidal group from scratch and who rarely spoke about the people who had been close to him while he did it. He thought about how many stories like this one had unfolded in the shadows of that empire while he was growing up without ever noticing them. And for the first time in his life, that ignorance did not feel neutral to him. It felt unforgivable. That night he did not sleep. He sat in his apartment, in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows without turning on any lights, letting the darkness be a companion to the silence he needed. He thought about Rosa, about those quiet hands resting on the blanket. He thought about the boy with his pot of soup and that expression that had no business being 16. He thought about Lucia kneeling beside the bed with a tenderness no manual had taught her. And he thought above all about something Rosa had said that he could not get out of his head. Look after your mama. She does not look after herself. How long had Lucia gone without looking after herself? How long had she been carrying all of this without a single person in her work environment ever asking how she was doing? 2 years. Lucia had worked in his hotel for nearly 2 years, and he did not even know her mother's name. The next morning, Alexander arrived before the first shift began. He waited with his office door slightly ajar until he heard the sound of Lucia's cart moving down the hallway of the 22nd floor. He got up, walked to the door. Lucia had her back to him, preparing her shift with that quiet efficiency he had overlooked for 2 years. Precise movements, no wasted time. The discipline of someone who cannot afford to lose a single minute at work because every minute away from home is a minute someone else needs her somewhere else. Lucia? She turned. Her eyes were dark and steady with the calm of people who have learned not to anticipate anything good when a superior calls their name.
Good morning, Mr. Vidal.
He hesitated for exactly 1 second, then said what he had not planned to say, what came out before any calculation could stop it. I need you to come to my office. There is something important we need to talk about. Lucia's expression did not change, but her hands, resting on the cart, tensed for just a moment. Just long enough for someone who was truly watching to notice it. And Alexander, for the first time in 2 years, was truly watching. What he saw in those hands was not guilt. It was the quiet fear of a woman who has built everything on a very thin thread, and who knows, with the wisdom that only suffering gives, that thin threads snap without warning, and that, when they do, there is no net below, just the fall.
There are conversations one rehearses mentally before having them. Alexander had rehearsed this one while waiting in his office while listening to Lucia's footsteps approaching down the hallway. He had built in his mind an orderly version of what he was going to say. Direct, professional, no room for emotion. He would tell her he knew what she had been doing. He would give her the chance to explain. He would listen. He would decide. That was how things worked in Alexander Vidal's world. Structure. Control. Enough distance to keep decisions from being contaminated by feelings that did not belong there. But Lucia Paredes walked into that office and something in the rehearsal broke before it even began. It was not her expression. It was not any dramatic gesture or obvious signal of what she carried. It was precisely the opposite. Lucia walked in with a calm that was not indifference, but armor. With the straight posture of people who have learned that showing fear only gives more power to those who already have too much. She sat in the chair across the desk, folded her hands in her lap, and looked him directly in the eyes. And Alexander, who had spent the night building his arguments, suddenly did not know where to begin. "Lucia," he said finally, "thank you for coming." She nodded once and said nothing more. She did not fill the silence with unnecessary words. She simply waited, with a stillness that Alexander found more difficult to manage than any direct confrontation. "I need to ask you something," he continued, and his voice came out more careful than he had planned, as if something in him no longer wanted to cause this woman pain, even though he did not yet fully understand why. "About the bags you have been taking out of the hotel." The silence that followed lasted only 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, Alexander saw something move across Lucia's eyes. Not panic, not denial. Something far more complex and far more devastating than either of those. It was surrender. The quiet surrender of someone who has spent a long time waiting for the moment when everything collapses, and who, when it finally arrives, no longer has the energy to pretend surprise. "I know what you are referring to," said Lucia. Her voice did not tremble. It was flat and clear, like the surface of still water. "I know exactly what you are referring to, Mr. Vidal." He waited. She took one breath and spoke. "My mother's name is Rosa Paredes. She is 71 years old, and for more than 2 years she has been unable to walk on her own or care for herself. She has a condition that has been slowly taking her mobility, first her legs, then her arms. The doctors say it will keep progressing. There is no cure. There is only management, and management costs money I do not have." She paused briefly, then continued. "I live with my son Thomas in a house that barely qualifies as one. Between the rent, the food, my mother's medications, and Thomas's school expenses, my paycheck does not stretch far enough. It does not stretch even working 12 hours a day. It does not stretch even when I have not bought anything for myself in over a year. It does not stretch, Mr. Vidal. And when something does not stretch, and you have your mother lying there with an infected wound on her arm because you cannot afford antiseptic from the drugstore, you do what you can with what you have nearby." She paused. She looked down at her hands for a moment, as if searching for something in them. "I did not take those things to sell. I did not do it out of greed or habit. I did it because it was the only thing available to keep my mother from getting worse. And I know that does not justify it legally. I know what I did was wrong. But if I were put back in that moment with my mother feverish and nothing at home to clean her wound, I would do it again." She raised her eyes and looked at him directly once more. "If you're going to let me go, I understand. I only ask that you give me until the end of the month to find another job before it takes effect. For my son." Alexander did not respond immediately. He was processing something that went beyond the words he had just heard. He was processing the way Lucia had said them,
without pleading, without drama, with the dignity intact of someone who has made difficult decisions and is willing to be accountable for them, even if they cost her everything. "How long has your mother been sick?" he asked, and even he could hear that his voice sounded different, less like a boss, more like a human being. Lucia blinked. That was clearly not the question she had expected. "Almost 3 years," she said after a moment. "It started in her feet. We kept saying it was fatigue, that it would pass. But it did not pass. It kept advancing slowly, and by the time the doctors had a name for what she had already lost a lot of mobility. Now she spends most of her time in bed. She can sit up. With help she can move her arms a little, but walking she cannot do anymore. She probably never will again." "Who takes care of her when you are at work?" "Thomas, my son. He is 16 and he knows what to do if she needs something urgent. I left him the number for the doctor at the neighborhood health clinic and the number for a neighbor who checks in sometimes. But basically it is him. A 16-year-old boy taking care of a sick grandmother while his mother works 12 hours. Alexander let that settle in silence. "And her medical follow-up. Does she see doctors regularly?" Lucia hesitated for just 1 second. The kind of hesitation that reveals the answer is uncomfortable. "We had monthly appointments at the public hospital, but I canceled the last 2 because the transportation cost more than I could spend that day, and I needed that money for the medications. The doctor who treats her told me she should come in at least every 6 weeks, that the follow-up is important for adjusting the doses. But between knowing what should happen and being able to make it happen, there is a distance that sometimes cannot be crossed." Alexander slowly walked to the window and stood with his back to Lucia, looking outside with his hands in his pockets. Not because he was avoiding the conversation, but because he needed a moment when she could not see his face. Because his face in that moment was not the face of an executive managing a human resources issue. It was the face of a man being shown something that had always existed very close to him, something he had preferred not to see. "How long have you been working here, Lucia?" "Almost 2 years, sir. And before here, I worked in other hotels, always in housekeeping." "Right now." "Mama?" Matthias said, his voice rising with controlled panic. "I think we need to take him to the hospital. He's getting worse." It was something between a statement and the beginning of something larger he did not yet know how to name. "Yes," answered Lucia. And something in her tone shifted almost imperceptibly, a new carefulness in her words, like someone walking on ground they know but suspect could give way. "What part of the city?" Lucia looked at him for a moment before answering. "In several areas, but most of her life she worked in Lomas del Pedregal." Alexander knew that neighborhood well. It was where he had grown up. "Which households?" he asked, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. Lucia took a slow breath, and in that breath, before the words arrived, Alexander felt, with physical certainty, that what he was about to hear was going to change something that could not be changed back. "Most of the time," Lucia said with a calm that cost her dearly, "she worked for one family, nearly 20 years. She arrived when I was young and stayed until her illness no longer allowed her to continue. She was the family's most trusted employee. She knew every corner of that house. She knew the children. She watched them grow." A pause. "It was your father's house, Mr. Vidal. My mother worked for Arthur Vidal for nearly 20 years. The silence that fell over that office was different from all the silences before it. Alexander did not move. He said nothing. He stood still beside the window, processing information that was rearranging everything he thought he understood. Rosa Paredes, a woman he had never put a face to, whose name he had never heard spoken in his childhood home with any particular weight, had spent nearly 2 decades in that house. She had known his family. She had known him probably when he was just a boy too young to understand what it meant for someone to spend 20 years of their life caring for someone else's home. "I knew her," he said quietly. It was not quite a question. Lucia nodded. "You were very young when she started. I imagine you do not remember her." Children in those households rarely remember the people who work there. Not because they are bad children, but because no one ever teaches them to look. There was no accusation in those words, only an observation, one that entered Alexander like a thin needle and stayed there. "Why did she stop working for my father? It was the illness," said Lucia. She looked at him for a moment that lasted slightly longer than necessary. "But as for the rest of that, I would prefer you ask your father directly." And in that answer, in that polite and firm refusal to elaborate, Alexander heard something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was not evasion out of fear. It was the deliberate restraint of someone who carries a truth heavy enough to choose carefully when and how to release it. There was something more in that story, something Lucia knew and was not going to say. Not yet. They sat in silence for a few seconds. Outside the office, the hotel continued its usual rhythm. Carts in the hallways, elevators, distant voices, the normal world of an ordinary Tuesday that had no idea what was happening inside that room. "Lucia," Alexander said finally, "you are not being let go." She did not show immediate relief. She simply looked at him with the expression he was beginning to recognize, the one that belongs to someone who has learned that good news almost always comes with something attached to the back of it. "The salary you have now is not enough for what you are carrying. Starting this month, that changes, and your mother's medical expenses will be covered by the company as long as you work here." Lucia opened her mouth, closed it. "Mr. Vidal, I did not come here to ask for anything." "I know," he said, cutting her off gently. "You are not asking. I am offering, and there is an important difference between those two things." She looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time since she had walked into that office, something in her face changed. It was not a smile. It was something smaller and harder to sustain than a smile. It was the briefest flash of someone who has been carrying alone for so long that receiving help feels almost more difficult than continuing to carry. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why are you doing this?" He could have said something professional, something about corporate responsibility or employee wellness initiatives. He had that vocabulary available, and it would have been easier to use. But he told the truth instead. "Because last night I watched you clean your mother's wound with what little you had. And because I realized that you have been working for me for 2 years and I did not even know her name." Lucia did not respond. She lowered her eyes for a moment to her hands. Those same hands Alexander had watched tense against the cart that morning, and that were now still in her lap with a different kind of stillness, less guarded, just barely more rested. "There is something you need to know," said Lucia, without yet raising her eyes. "Something about my mother and about this company that is going to come to light eventually anyway. I would rather you hear it from me before you discover it some other way." Alexander sat slowly on the edge of the desk. "I am listening." Lucia raised her eyes, and in them there was something that had not been there before. Not fear, not surrender. The quiet determination of someone who has finally decided that the moment has come to tell the truth, even if it costs, even if it changes everything, even if there is no way of knowing whether what comes after will be better or worse than what came before. "My mother did not stop working for your father only because of her illness," she said. "She was let go. And the way it was done after nearly 20 years is something you need to know. Because it has to do with who your father is. and with who you have been without knowing it. Outside, the hotel continued its Tuesday rhythm. Inside, something was about to break forever. There are questions one avoids asking a parent. Not because the answer is not wanted, but because somewhere deep inside a person already suspects the answer is going to require seeing that parent in an entirely different light. And seeing your father differently is one of those pains no one prepares you for, because the world assumes fathers are what they appear to be, and very few people talk about what happens when you discover they are not. Alexander Vidal was 32 years old. He had never asked his father a question the man did not want to answer. That was about to change. After Lucia left his office, Alexander sat motionless for several minutes. The conversation had ended with that phrase suspended in the air, the one Lucia had let fall, with the precision of someone who knows exactly the weight of what they are releasing. It has to do with who your father is, and with who you have been without knowing it. It was not an accusation. It was something harder to manage than an accusation. It was an invitation to open a door that had been closed for years without knowing what was inside, knowing only that what was inside had been waiting a long time to come out. He canceled his afternoon meetings, something he had not done in 2 years of running the hotel group, not once for personal reasons. His assistant looked at him with a surprise she tried to hide and did not fully succeed. Alexander gave her no explanation. He took his car and drove 40 minutes to the house where his father had lived his entire adult life. The same house where Alexander had grown up in Lomas del Pedregal, with its natural stone walls and its garden that someone always tended with a dedication Alexander had never once thought to thank anyone for. Arthur Vidal was 68 years old. He had the build of a man who had worked with his hands before he learned to work with his head. Broad shoulders, completely white hair he had carried since his 50s, giving him an authority he never needed to cultivate because he already had it. He was in the back garden when Alexander arrived, sitting in a wooden chair with a coffee mug in his hand and the newspaper folded on the table beside him, looking out at the trees with the expression of older men who have learned to be still without the stillness unsettling them. He looked up when he heard his son's footsteps. "I was not expecting company," he said. It was not a reproach, just an observation. "I know," said Alexander. "I need to talk to you about something." Arthur looked at him for a moment. That look of his that did not evaluate but weighed, that measured things before deciding what to do with them. "Sit down," he said. Alexander sat across from him. He declined the coffee his father offered with a gesture. He went directly to the point because with Arthur, detours did not work, and he had known that since childhood. "Do you know a woman named Rosa Paredes?" His father's reaction was not dramatic. There was no sudden start, no sharp change of expression. It was something far more revealing than either of those. It was a sudden stillness. The specific stillness of someone who hears a name they recognize immediately and who in the very next second decides how much they are going to show. "Why are you asking me that?" said Arthur. And his voice sounded the same as always, but something in the rhythm was different, just barely. Enough for Alexander, who had grown up learning to read this man, to notice it. "Because her daughter works for me. She has been at the hotel for almost 2 years, and this morning I found out that Rosa Paredes worked in this house for nearly 20 years. Arthur looked toward the trees. He took a sip of coffee, set the mug down on the table with a calm that Alexander recognized as the same calm his father used in difficult negotiations, the calm that was not peace but control. "Rosie?" he said finally in a low voice, and in that nickname there was something Alexander had not expected to find in his father's voice, a different texture, something that resembled nostalgia very closely, something Arthur clearly had no intention of displaying. "How is she?" he asked. "Not well," said Alexander without softening it. "Her daughter is caring for her alone. She has been weakening, cannot move well, and until this morning she had no adequate medical coverage. Lucia had been taking antiseptic and cleaning supplies from my hotel for months to treat her wounds because she could not afford to buy them." Arthur did not respond immediately. He continued looking at the trees, and Alexander saw something he had never seen in his father's face in 32 years of life. He watched him take the blow, not the way another person would. There was no visible gesture, no expression that shifted dramatically. But there was something in Arthur's eyes, something brief and very deep that resembled pain, real pain, the kind of pain that comes from knowing that something you did or failed to do had consequences that reached far further than you ever allowed yourself to imagine. "Why did she stop working here?" asked Alexander, and this time his voice was not that of a son asking an uncomfortable question. It was the voice of a man who needs an answer and is not leaving without one. Arthur set the coffee mug down, leaned back slightly in the chair, and for a moment Alexander thought he was going to deflect the question with that skill he had for turning any difficult conversation into something that ended up being about something else entirely. But he did not. "The company was going through a difficult period," he said. "A few years back, you were already leading the group, but I was still managing some of the household administrative matters. We had to make cuts. Rosie had been here a long time, and her wages had been adjusted over the years. She had accumulated benefits, seniority. On the balance sheet, it was a significant expense." Alexander looked at him steadily. "You fired her to save money." It was not a question. It was a statement delivered quietly, with the surgical precision that simple truths sometimes carry when spoken without embellishment. Arthur did not respond immediately, and that silence was more eloquent than any answer could have been. "She had been in this house for almost 20 years, Alexander continued. 20 years, Dad, and you let her go like she was a line item in a spreadsheet." "It was not that simple," said Arthur, and for the first time in the conversation his voice lost some of its characteristic solidity. "There was a proper severance. All the correct processes were followed." "The processes," repeated Alexander. "That is what matters, that the processes were correct." Arthur then looked at him directly, with that gaze that since childhood had seemed to Alexander the most difficult in the world to hold, because it was a gaze that neither asked nor gave permission for anything. It simply was. "What matters," said Arthur with a calm that now cost more to maintain, "is that I made a business decision at that moment, as I made thousands of business decisions throughout my life. Some turned out well. Others, with time, I see differently." "You see this one differently." A long pause. "Yes," admitted Arthur very quietly. "This one I see differently." It was the first time in Alexander's life that he heard something resembling regret in his father's voice. It was not an apology. Arthur Vidal did not apologize. But it was something. It was the acknowledgement that something had been wrong, and that the wrongness had had a real cost in a real life. And that cost was not abstract or statistical. It was concrete and human. It had a name. Rosa Paredes. Rosie. The woman who had spent nearly 20 years in that house and who was now in a bed she could not leave, being cared for by a daughter who took antiseptic from a luxury hotel because it was the only thing she had available. "There is something else you need to know," said Arthur, after a silence that pressed between them like something physical. Alexander waited. "When I made the decision to let Rosie go, she had already been showing the first symptoms of what we later learned was her illness. I knew.
She had told me because we were close enough that she felt she could tell me. And I still made the decision I made because the numbers did not work out, and I needed to fix that. And in that moment, I was able to separate what I knew from what I decided. The garden was completely still. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. "You fired her knowing she was sick," said Alexander. And his voice came out so flat, so devoid of inflection, that it was more devastating than any outburst could have been. Arthur opened his eyes. They were bright in a way Alexander had never seen on him before. "Yes," he said. One word, 3 letters. And in those 3 letters was a confession that Arthur Vidal had carried for years in silence, in that way he had of carrying things, which was never to speak of them, never to look back, to keep moving forward, as if forward motion could compensate for what had been left behind. Alexander stood slowly, not abruptly, not with visible anger. He stood like someone who needs to put distance between himself and what he has just heard in order to process it without breaking apart right there. He walked to the edge of the garden. He stood with his back to his father, looking out at the same trees Arthur had been watching when he arrived. And he thought about Lucia. In that office that morning, hands folded quietly in her lap, voice steady, telling the truth even though it might cost her everything. He thought about Thomas with his pot of soup and his 16 years carrying what was not his to carry. He thought about Rosa, with her eyes alive and her hands on the blanket, and the words she had said to her grandson. "Look after your mama. She does not look after herself." And he thought about himself, about the 32 years he had lived inside that last name, as if inside a suit of armor, without ever asking what lay beneath the decisions that had built that name, without ever wondering who had paid a price for what had come to him as inheritance. He turned to face his father. "I am going to take care of Rosa Paredes," he said. "Her treatment, her medications, everything she needs. And I am going to do it not as a favor, but as what it is. A debt. A debt this family owes that woman, one that should have been settled years ago." Arthur looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "I know," he said finally, and he let those 2 words say everything he could not say any other way. Alexander nodded. He took his car keys, then stopped for a moment. "She knows where you live," he said. "Does Rosa know you are still in this house?" Arthur paused for a second. "I do not know. Probably. Rosie always knew everything that happened in this house. That was just who she was." Alexander looked at him once more, and in that look there was something new, something that had not been present in any of the glances he had directed at his father in 32 years. It was not hatred. It was not simple disappointment. It was something more complex and more mature than either of those things. It was the look of a son who has just seen his father as what he truly is. Not the invincible man of childhood, not the ruthless executive of adulthood, but a man with everything that word contains. Greatness and failure, real achievements and mistakes that have no fix, but that perhaps if one is brave enough can still have consequences that matter. He drove back to the city with the window down, letting the air hit his face. He was thinking about how the next day he needed to speak with Lucia again, about how there were things she needed to know and things he needed to say, about how the story between these 2 families was longer and more tangled than either of them had imagined that morning in the office. And he was also thinking about something he could not get out of his head. Rosa had spent 19 years in that house. She had watched him grow up. She had been present during the hardest years of his childhood after his mother left, when Arthur worked without stopping and the house needed someone to hold it together. And her daughter, without knowing the full extent of all that had ended up working for him. That was not coincidence. Alexander knew it.
Things like this are never coincidence. They are the result of decisions made years before, of paths that cross again and again, because life has that relentless way of closing the circles people leave open. The circle had been there, open for years, waiting for someone with the courage to close it properly. And Alexander Vidal, for the first time in his life, understood that the person who had to close it was him. There are things mothers keep to protect their children, not out of cowardice, not out of weakness, but because there is a kind of love that calculates, that measures, that consciously decides how much weight a person can carry before it bends them. And mothers who have watched their children suffer develop a fierce instinct for sensing that limit and refusing to cross it, even if that means carrying alone things that should never be carried alone. Rosa Paredes had kept many things for many years. But that afternoon, when Alexander Vidal knocked on her door, she knew the time for keeping them had run out. Lucia was not home. She had gone out to handle some errands that could not wait. Thomas had opened the door with the expression of a teenager who calibrates in fractions of a second whether a visitor is a threat or not. When he saw Alexander, the calibration was visible. Not fear, the reasoned distrust of someone who has learned that well-dressed men who show up at the door generally do not bring good news. "I am Alexander Vidal, Lucia's boss. Is your grandmother here?" Thomas looked at him for a moment longer than strictly necessary, then opened the door wider. "She is inside, but she gets tired quickly." He followed the boy down a short hallway into the room where Rosa spent most of her hours. The house in daylight was different from how Alexander had seen it through the window at night. Smaller in a certain sense. More real. The light came in through a side window and illuminated details the darkness had hidden. A shelf with 3 well-read books. A framed photograph on the bedside table. A small plant on the windowsill that someone watered carefully because it had the healthy look of things that receive attention even when everything else is scarce. Rosa was sitting up, propped against the headboard with 2 pillows behind her. Her eyes were open when Alexander entered, and in the second she saw him, something in her face made a strange movement. Not quite surprise, something closer to recognition, as if she had been expecting this visit, not today specifically, but at some point on some day she had always known would eventually come. "Alexander," she said. "Not Mr. Vidal, not sir, just his name, the way you name someone you have known for a very long time, even if years have passed since you saw them." He stopped in the doorway and looked at her, and all at once, with a clarity he had not had when his father spoke the name that afternoon in the garden, he recognized her. Not as a concept, not as a story he had been told, he recognized her in the deep physical sense of when the body remembers something the mind had filed very far back. This woman had been in his kitchen, in his hallway. She had been present on the mornings when he came downstairs to have breakfast and his father had already left and the house was silent. And she had put something warm on the table without saying anything, without asking how he was, because she had the wisdom to know that sometimes children do not need questions. They just need someone to be there. "Rosa," he said, and his voice came out lower than he intended. "Come in, sweetheart. Do not just stand in the doorway." Nobody called him sweetheart. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him like that. The word arrived in a way he had not expected, with that capacity that simple words have to open doors you believed were locked. He sat in the chair Thomas had moved close to the bed without being asked. The teenager remained standing in the doorway, not fully entering, but not leaving either, watching over the room with the quiet loyalty of a boy who has grown up being the only man in the house. "How are you?" Alexander asked. Rosa made a small gesture with her hand that meant more or less. That meant within the circumstances. That meant exactly what Lucia said when asked how she was and answered that everything was fine. How much did your father tell you? Asked Rosa.
Enough, said Alexander. He told me he let you go knowing you were already sick. Rosa nodded slowly, without drama, with the serenity of someone who has had a great deal of time to make peace with something.
Your father is a complicated man, she said. But he is not a bad one. I want you to understand that clearly. Arthur is not a bad man. But he learned very early that feelings cost something, and that in business, whatever costs must be eliminated. The trouble is that over the years it crept into other parts of his life as well. And sometimes he could no longer tell where business ended and everything else began. Alexander listened without interrupting. When he told me he no longer needed my services, Rosa continued, I already knew what I had. The doctors had explained how it would progress, and yes, it hurt. I will not lie to you and say it did not hurt. 19 years in a house leave roots whether you want them to or not. But what hurt me most was not losing the job. She paused. Her hands moved slightly on the blanket.
What hurt me most was thinking about Lucia, knowing how she was going to carry all of this alone. Because Lucia has always been that way, ever since she was small.
She puts the whole world on her shoulders and says nothing. She smiles and keeps going, and I knew that when I could no longer work, she was going to do exactly that. Put the world on her shoulders, smile, and keep going. Does she know how your time at my father's house ended? Asked Alexander. Does she know the full story? Rosa looked at him for a moment. She knows I worked there for many years. She knows I was let go. What she does not know is everything else.
What is everything else?
The room was very quiet.
Thomas remained in the doorway. The small plant on the windowsill caught the last light of the afternoon. Rosa breathed deeply and began to speak. When I started working in that house, she said, you were 8 years old, and your mother had not been gone very long.
The house was dim. That is the only way I can describe it. Your father worked from sunrise to sunset because work was the only way he knew to stop thinking. And you were a boy who came home from school to a silent house and went looking in the kitchen for someone who would see you. Alexander said nothing. But something in the way he was sitting changed. I remember the day you came home with a broken backpack, Rosa continued. You must have been around 10 years old. You had sewn it yourself with kitchen twine because you did not want to bother your father with something so small. I saw it and said nothing that day, but the next morning there was a new backpack in your room. Your father never knew where it had come from. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment. I bought it, said Rosa simply, with that week's paycheck. Because no child should go to school with a backpack sewn together with kitchen twine and carry on top of that the weight of not wanting to be a burden to anyone. The silence that followed was the kind that does not ask to be filled. Alexander had a very vague memory of that backpack. He had not thought about it in more than 20 years. But now that Rosa named it, something came back. The color. The smell of something new. The feeling of carrying it to school the next day, not fully understanding where it had come from, but feeling for some reason he could not then name just a little less alone. Why did you never tell me it was you? He asked. Because I did not do it so you would thank me, answered Rosa with a simplicity more powerful than any solemn declaration. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Simple as that. Alexander looked at her. This woman who had spent 19 years in his home, who had bought a backpack with her own paycheck for a boy who was not hers, who had held together a household that was not hers, and who in the end had been let go when she could no longer work well, and the numbers did not add up. Is there something else I do not know? He asked, and something in his tone made clear it was not a casual question. He had come to this room with the suspicion that the story had more layers than his father had shown him. Rosa looked at him for a long, steady moment. "There is one thing," she said. "One thing Lucia does not know, and I believe it is time she knew. And time you knew as well." Alexander waited. "When they let me go, I was entitled to a full severance package, 19 years of service. Your father offered me an amount that did not correspond to that time, significantly less. And I, who was already sick and frightened and alone, signed it. I signed because I needed something immediately, and because I did not have the strength to fight." Rosa's voice did not tremble, but her hands did, barely, almost imperceptibly. But Alexander saw it. "Lucia never knew that," she continued. "I never told her how much I was owed or how much I received. I told her they gave me what was fair, because I did not want her to carry that anger. Because anger weighs, Alexander. And Lucia was already carrying enough." Alexander slowly walked to the window. Outside, the afternoon was closing in. The streets of that neighborhood were filling with that particular sound that working-class neighborhoods have at the end of the day. A sound that mixes life with exhaustion in a way that wealthier places never have. "How much was the difference?" he asked without turning. Rosa told him a figure. It was not a fortune in absolute terms, but in terms of what that woman had needed at that time, in terms of what it would have meant for Lucia in the years that followed, in terms of the medical treatment that could not be paid for, the appointments that were canceled because transportation cost too much. It was a difference that had had real, concrete consequences in every single difficult day they had lived since. Alexander turned. "Do you have the severance agreement?" Rosa gestured toward the shelf with the 3 books. Behind the second one, folded with the care given to important documents, kept without quite knowing why, but unable to throw away, was an envelope. Thomas retrieved it before Alexander finished asking. He handed it to his grandmother, and Rosa passed it to Alexander without saying anything more. He opened it. He read it. And as he read, he felt something that was not exactly anger, because anger implies surprise, and he was no longer surprised. It was something colder and more determined, the clarity of someone who has just fully understood the size of what needs to be corrected. He folded the document carefully, tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket. "This is going to be corrected," he said. "The difference, the interest, all of it. It will be in her account before the end of the week." Rosa looked at him. "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know," said Alexander. "That is exactly why I am going to." They sat in quiet for a moment. Outside there was the sound of a key in the lock, footsteps in the hallway, and then Lucia's voice from the entrance. That voice Alexander now recognized as the real one. The one she used at home, the one that carried none of the professional polish of the hotel. "I am home. How is everyone?" She stopped in the doorway when she saw Alexander. The expression on her face was a mixture of things occurring simultaneously, things that were difficult to separate. Surprise, alarm, a question she did not know how to form. And beneath all of it, very deep, something that resembled the fear of someone who discovers that 2 worlds she had kept carefully separate have just collided. "Mr. Vidal," she said, "what are you doing here?" Alexander looked at her, then at Rosa, and in the exchange of glances between mother and daughter in that moment, there was an entire conversation without words. One of those conversations that only exist between people who know each other so deeply that language becomes unnecessary. Rosa gave a slight nod toward her daughter, a small gesture. But Lucia understood it. "Sit down, sweetheart," said Rosa. "Mr. Vidal and I have been talking, and I think it is time you knew some things I kept from you to protect you." Lucia looked at her mother, then at Alexander, then back at her mother, and she sat with the obedience that is not submission, but trust. The trust of a daughter who knows that her mother, even when she has kept things, has never kept anything that was not out of love. What came next would change everything Lucia believed she knew about her history, about the Vidal family, and about the debts that exist between people long before those people know they have them. Lucia listened to all of it without interrupting. That was what struck Alexander most in that moment. Not the tears, though they came. Not the trembling in her hands, though it was there. But that ability to sit completely still while the world she thought she knew rearranged itself before her eyes with the same quiet discipline with which she had faced everything else. Rosa spoke slowly, without drama, in that way she had of saying difficult things that made them at once softer and more devastating, because they did not come wrapped in spectacle, but in plain truth. And plain truth without wrapping hurts in a particular way that has no antidote. She told her everything. The 19 years in the Vidal house, the years after Alexander's mother left when the house needed someone to hold it together, and she did it without anyone formally asking, because it was what needed to be done. She told her about the 8-year-old boy who came downstairs to have breakfast alone. She told her about the backpack sewn with kitchen twine. She told her how she had watched Alexander grow up from the distance of someone who is present without belonging, who cares without the caring being named, who loves without that love having a comfortable title. Because in those homes, the love between an employee and a family does not have an easy name. And then she told her about the severance. Lucia said nothing when she heard the figure. She simply closed her eyes for a moment. And in that moment, Alexander saw in her face something he recognized, because he had seen it that same afternoon in his father's garden when Arthur had taken the blow without fully showing it. The pain of understanding that something that had hurt deeply something carried for years, as if it were simply the normal weight of life, had in fact a specific origin, a decision, a person, a particular moment when someone chose convenience over justice. "Mama," said Lucia finally. Her voice was very low. "Why did you not tell me?" Rosa looked at her with the serenity that only belongs to people who have thought a great deal about an answer before they ever had to give it. "Because I have known you since the day you were born, my girl. And I know that if you had found out I was fired that way, sick with an incomplete settlement, you would have carried that anger every day of your life. You would have carried it while you worked, while you raised your children, while you took care of me. And that anger would have weighed on you more than anything else. I chose to carry it for you, rather than let you carry it for me." Lucia opened her mouth, closed it. The tears came quietly, without sobs, in the way that people cry who have learned to cry without making noise so as not to frighten anyone. Thomas, who had been standing in the doorway the entire time, moved slowly and sat on the edge of the bed beside his grandmother. He took her hand without saying anything, and that simple gesture, a 16-year-old boy taking the hand of his sick grandmother in the middle of a truth that overwhelmed him in years and in weight, was what finally broke Lucia's composure completely. She covered her face with her hands and wept. Not the contained crying of before, the real crying. The kind that comes when a person no longer has the strength to keep being strong. The kind that accumulates months and years of carrying alone, of smiling, of saying everything is fine when nothing is entirely fine. Alexander said nothing. It was not the moment for words. It was the moment to let that family have what they needed to have, even if it was painful, even if it cost. Because there are pains that cleanse, and there are truths that, even when they arrive late, arrive exactly when they were meant to. It was Rosa who broke the silence. And she did it by looking directly at Alexander with those dark, living eyes she had not lost despite everything. "You are not your father, Alexander," she said. I need you to know that. Arthur made decisions that were not right. But you are a different man. I can see it in why you are here today. I can see it in the way you look at my daughter when you think no one is watching. Alexander did not respond, but he did not look away either. Lucia lowered her hands. She looked at him with her eyes still wet. The expression of someone who has just passed through something and does not yet know on which shore they have landed. "Why did you come here today?" she asked. "To this house, to talk to her in person. Why not send someone, or call, or simply deposit the money and close the file?" Alexander thought for a moment about the answer and chose the truth over the comfortable version. "Because 2 nights ago I stood outside that window," he said. "I watched you clean your mother's wound with what little you had. I saw Thomas with his pot of soup, and I understood that I had been running a company for 2 years without knowing anything about the people who made it function. I came because I needed to look at this face to face, not from outside a window. Face to face. The room was completely still. Rosa held Thomas's hand. Lucia looked at him with an expression that mixed gratitude with a distrust that had not yet finished dissolving, because reasoned distrust does not disappear all at once, even when it wants to. And Alexander understood that. He was not expecting it to disappear all at once. Some things are rebuilt slowly, or they are not rebuilt at all. And the only thing a person can do is be consistent and let time do what words cannot. He stood, took the envelope from his pocket, and left it on the bedside table beside the framed photograph. The difference from the settlement plus the interest from all these years. The rest will be deposited directly into her account by Monday. This is just the confirmation. Rosa looked at the envelope. She did not pick it up immediately.
"Thank you,"
she said finally, with the same simplicity with which she had said everything else. Without exaggeration, without tears, with the dignity intact of someone who receives what was always hers and does not need to make a spectacle of it. Alexander nodded. He looked at Lucia one last time. "Tomorrow we continue talking. There are still things to resolve." She nodded, and as he moved toward the door, her voice stopped him. "Alexander." It was the first time she had called him by his first name, alone. Without the mister, without the sir, just his name, the way her mother had said it when he walked into the room. "Thank you for coming," said Lucia. "For coming in person. For coming for real." He did not respond. He stepped out into the street, where the night had fully closed in, and walked to his car, thinking that that phrase, so short, so simple, weighed more than any contract he had ever signed. For coming for real. How many times had he been present in a place without truly being there? How many conversations had he had without truly listening? How many people had been close to him, working for him, holding things up, without his awareness, without his question, without it ever occurring to him that behind every name on a payroll was a story that deserved to be seen. He started the car and knew with a certainty that needed no words that what had begun that night outside a window had not ended. It was only just beginning. In the days that followed, Lucia Paredes's life began to change in ways she did not yet know how to name. Not all at once, not in any dramatic or cinematic way. Slowly, the way things change that are going to last, with the quiet solidity of what is built well from the foundation and does not need to make noise to prove it is real. The first thing that changed was Rosa's care. Dr. Hector Salinas arrived on a Tuesday morning with his black medical bag and that way he had of entering modest spaces without making people feel observed. He was a man in his early 50s, lean, wearing thin-framed glasses with the permanent expression of someone who has seen too much avoidable suffering. and has decided the only possible response is to keep working. He had treated Rosa for years at the neighborhood health clinic, within the limitations of a system that always had less than it needed and more patients than it could serve well. But that morning, he arrived with something different. He arrived with time. With comprehensive tests Rosa had never been able to have done. With a referral to a specialist at a private clinic that would cover everything the public system could not reach. Alexander had arranged all of it without announcing it, without calling Lucia to say what he was doing, without waiting for gratitude. He had done it because it was what needed to be done, and because he had learned in the days since that night outside the window that actions done while waiting for recognition are not generosity. They are transactions in disguise. Dr. Salinas examined Rosa with a thoroughness she had not experienced in a long time. He adjusted her medications, explained with patience what each one did and why the order in which she took them mattered. He spoke to her the way you speak to an intelligent person who deserves to understand her own situation, not the way you speak to a sick elderly woman who only needs to follow instructions. When he finished, he stepped into the hallway where Lucia was waiting with Thomas, and he said something neither of them would ever forget. Your mother is not going to recover the mobility she has lost. That is not going to change. But with the right treatment and consistent follow-up, what she has does not have to progress as quickly. We can give her years of stability, and those years, with the care you give her, can be good years. Thomas looked at the doctor and then looked at his mother, and in that look there was something Lucia recognized, because it was the same thing she had felt when Alexander left the envelope on Rosa's nightstand. It was the relief of knowing that someone else was holding a share of the weight. Later that evening, after Dr. Salinas had gone and Rosa slept with a new peace that comes from knowing someone competent is watching over you, Thomas sat beside his mother in the small living area and asked something he had been wanting to ask for days. Mom, is Mr. Vidal a good person? Lucia took a moment to answer. I think he is learning to be one, she said finally. And that sometimes matters more than being born that way. Thomas processed that in silence. Then, with his way of going directly to the center of things, he said, And my dad, was he also learning when he left? The question arrived without warning and with its full weight. Lucia let it settle before responding, because it was a question that deserved a real answer, not a comfortable one. Your father, she said slowly, was a man who wanted to be better than he was able to be. He left when you were 3 years old, not because he did not love you, but because he was lost in things he could not handle alone. Sometimes people drown, and instead of asking for help, they disappear. It is the saddest mistake a person can make. Do you miss him? Sometimes I miss what could have been, answered Lucia honestly, which is different from missing the person. Thomas nodded slowly. Then he leaned against her shoulder with that affectionate awkwardness of teenagers who no longer quite know how to fit inside their own bodies, but who every now and then need to simply be children. Lucia held him and said nothing more, because nothing more needed to be said. Meanwhile, at the Hotel Vidal Imperial, other things were also changing. Gloria Mendez received Alexander in her small office in the housekeeping area with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a conversation and does not know whether what they are about to hear is good or bad. Alexander was direct. Lucia Paredes stays on, he said, with a salary adjustment that will show up in the next paycheck. And I want you to know that what you noticed and reported to me was exactly the right thing to do. You handled it well. Gloria looked at him. Can I ask what happened? What happened is that numbers do not always tell the whole story, said Alexander, and that I took far too long to understand that. A pause. And the storage key? Asked Gloria, because I still do not understand that. Lucia was not authorized to have it. Alexander had thought about this. He had spoken about it directly with Lucia 2 days earlier, in a brief and straightforward conversation. The key, he explained, was left behind by an employee from a previous shift who quit 4 months ago. Rodrigo Peña. Do you remember him? Gloria's brow furrowed slightly. Yes, he left without notice. He left without returning the backup storage key for his floor. He gave it to Lucia and told her to hold on to it until someone asked for it back. No one ever did. And when Lucia needed what she needed, the key was there. Gloria processed that quietly. So she never had proper authorization, she said. She never did, confirmed Alexander. But she was not actively seeking access either. It was a chain of administrative oversights that ended in a situation neither of them created intentionally. Starting this week, key return protocols are changing, and the storage inventory will have a daily logging system we are rolling out across all floors. Gloria nodded. Then, with the direct honesty Alexander had learned to value in her, she said something more. Mr. Vidal, Lucia is not the only employee in this hotel carrying something heavy alone. There are others. Alexander looked at her. I know, he said. That is why I want your help building something, not a program on paper. A real employee well-being protocol, with follow-up, with resources, with someone who listens before situations reach the point Lucia's did. Gloria looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not fully read. Then she said, I have been waiting years for someone to propose exactly that. Then let us start this week. A few days later, Alexander did something he had not planned, but that felt necessary with a clarity that did not allow for postponement. He went to see his father. Arthur was in the same garden as always, in the same chair with the same coffee. But something about him was different. Something very subtle, almost imperceptible, that Alexander identified after a few seconds. He was waiting, not with anxiety, with the specific stillness of older men who have learned that certain conversations come when they are ready to come, and the only thing anyone can do is be present when they arrive. Alexander sat across from him. I deposited the difference from Rosa Paredes' settlement, he said, with the corresponding interest for all these years. Arthur nodded slowly. How is she? Stable. She has proper medical follow-up now. The treatment has been adjusted. Good, said Arthur. And in that single word was a relief that had spent years with nowhere to go. There was a long silence between them, not an uncomfortable one. The kind of silence that exists between people who have said important things and are still processing the weight of having said them. I want to ask something of you, said Alexander finally. Arthur looked at him. I want you to go see her. The silence that followed was different from all the others, heavier, carrying things neither of them knew quite how to name. I do not know if she wants to see me, said Arthur. You will not know until you go, said Alexander. His father looked toward the trees for a long moment. Then, with the economy of words that had defined him his entire life, he said, Give me a few days. Alexander nodded. He stood. Before he left, he paused with one hand on the back of the chair, not quite turning around. Dad, the backpack, the one Rosa bought you when you were 11 years old, she told me. Arthur looked at him with an expression Alexander had never seen on him before. It was not yours, said Arthur very quietly. It was mine. I was 11 when I lost my mother. Rosa worked at that time in my parents' house. She bought me a backpack when mine broke because no one else noticed. I have spent my whole life knowing what that woman did for me. Alexander went very still. And still I made the decision I made, Arthur continued. That is what I cannot forgive myself for most. Not that I did it without knowing, that I did it knowing perfectly well, Alexander did not respond. There was no possible response to that. Only the bare truth of a man confronting the most difficult mirror that exists, the one that reflects his own contradictions. He walked out through the garden, where the afternoon was settling slowly, and headed to his car thinking that the history between those two families was far longer and far more tangled than he had imagined when it all began with a phone call from Gloria Mendez on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Arthur Vidal arrived at Rosa's house on a morning when the sky was overcast and the neighborhood streets had that particular quiet of days that seem to know something important is about to happen. He did not call ahead. He did not warn anyone. He simply appeared. The way people appear when they know that if they think about it too long, they will not go. Thomas opened the door and recognized him without having met him. He had his son's face serious and wide, with that white hair that apologized for nothing. The teenager stood in the doorway for a moment, calibrating. "I am here to see Rosa Paredes," said Arthur. Thomas let him in without a word, but stayed. Rosa was sitting up in the bed, with the pillows arranged behind her back, as if she had known she would have a visitor. When Arthur came through the door and she saw him, there was no shock, no drama. There was only the quiet recognition of two people who have carried a shared history for years and are finally in the same room to face it. "Arthur," she said. "Rosie," he answered. And in those two words, there were 19 years. There was a backpack. There was an incomplete settlement. There was guilt and gratitude and time lost and things that were never said when they should have been. Arthur sat in the chair beside the bed without removing his jacket, like someone who is not sure he has the right to get comfortable. "I came to apologize," he said, without preamble, without a prepared speech. "I know there is no way to undo what I did, but I needed to say that to you while looking you in the eyes." Rosa looked at him for a long, steady moment, with those eyes that had lost nothing despite everything. "Do you know what weighed on me most all these years, Arthur?" she asked. "It was not the settlement. It was not the money. It was knowing that you knew exactly what I had done for you when you were a boy, and that even knowing that you still chose what you chose." Arthur did not look away. He received that the way someone receives what they know they deserve and have decided once and for all to stop running from. "I know," he said, "and I lived with it." Rosa breathed slowly. "I forgave you a long time ago, Arthur. Not for your sake. I forgave you because holding on to the resentment was going to weigh on me far more than it was ever going to weigh on you. But forgiving does not mean it did not hurt. It means I chose not to let your decision define the rest of my life." Arthur closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was something in them that Alexander had never seen in his father, and that Thomas from the doorway observed with the silent attention of young people who are recording everything without adults knowing it. It was a man facing the most honest reflection of himself he had ever looked into, without armor, without the weight of the family name. Just an older man looking at the real consequences of a wrong decision and accepting that there was no going back, only forward. "I want you to know," said Arthur finally, "that what my son is doing was not my idea. He arrived at all of this on his own, and that tells me that somewhere in the middle of everything I did wrong, something came out right." Rosa looked at him for a moment, and then she did something no one in that room had expected. She smiled, not a polite smile, a real one, with that specific tenderness of people who have suffered a great deal and have learned that life is too long to hold on to nothing but the pain. "You were always too stubborn to be entirely lost, Arthur." Arthur let out a breath that carried more than air, And for the first time in that entire story, the man who had built an empire with his own hands seemed simply human. Thomas stepped away from the doorway quietly. Some conversations belong to the people who lived them. Weeks later, Lucia was in the same hallway of the 22nd floor when Alexander appeared, carrying 2 coffees, wearing that expression she had learned to recognize as belonging to someone who has something to say but is not quite sure where to begin. She stopped the cart. He extended one of the coffees. She accepted it. They sat on the steps of the service stairwell because the 22nd floor at that hour was quiet, and sometimes the most important conversations happen in the least formal places. Alexander pulled an envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket and handed it to her without preamble. Lucia opened it slowly, read it, and stayed looking at the paper for several seconds with an expression Alexander did not try to decipher. He let her take the time she needed. It was a proposal, not a charity arrangement. A real proposal, with a contract, with a salary, with concrete responsibilities. Lucia would move into a new role coordinating the employee well-being program across the Vidal group, working directly with Gloria Mendez in the Human Resources Department. Her duties would include identifying situations of vulnerability within the team, creating real channels for people to be heard, and making sure no employee ever again reached the point she had reached without someone knowing about it. "This is a real job," said Lucia. "It is a real job," confirmed Alexander. "Not charity with a title, a real job, because you are the only person in this company who knows exactly what the world looks like from the other side. And that knowledge is worth more than any credential I could hire for." Lucia folded the paper carefully, tucked it back inside the envelope, and looked out at the empty hallway with that expression of hers that belongs to someone processing something large without letting the largeness knock her over. "I am going to need to learn some things," she said, "to do this properly." "I already thought of that," said Alexander. "The company covers it. You choose the courses, the schedule, the format." He paused. "And Thomas enters the scholarship program we are putting together for employees' children. When he finishes high school, he has guaranteed access." Lucia closed her eyes for 1 second. Not a dramatic gesture. She closed her eyes the way someone does who needs a moment to hold something too large to contain on their face without it spilling over. When she opened them, she had the composure she always had. But there was something different in it. Something Alexander noticed but did not name, because some things work better without names. It was the beginning of rest. Not happiness, because happiness does not arrive all at once, but rest. The feeling that the weight was still there, but that for the first time in a very long time, there was more than one pair of hands holding it. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. And it was not the same question as before. Before, it had distrust in it. Now it was genuine. Alexander thought before answering, and chose the most honest version of the truth he had. "Because a woman I failed to see spent 19 years caring for my home without me ever knowing her name. And when I finally opened my eyes, I understood that the problem was never her. It was the size of my blind spot." Lucia looked at him. "And because," he continued, "you said something I cannot get out of my head. You said I came for real. And I want to keep being the kind of person who comes for real. I do not know how to do it perfectly, but I know I do not want to go back to what I was before." The hallway was quiet for a moment. Then Lucia did something simple that was worth more than any speech. She lifted her coffee cup toward him, a small toast, almost imperceptible. Alexander touched his cup to hers, and they sat there on the steps of a service stairwell drinking cooling coffee in a silent hallway, 2 people who had crossed the same storm by completely different routes and were only now finally standing on the same side.
That same evening, Lucia came home and found Thomas sitting at the table with a notebook open, and that look of concentration she recognized as hers when something had moved through him.
"What are you writing up?"
she asked. "A letter," he said without looking up. "For my dad, not to send, just to write." Lucia stood still for a moment, then went to the kitchen, made 2 cups of tea, came back and sat beside him. She said nothing. She did not ask what was in it. She was simply there. And that was enough, as it almost always was with Thomas. Enough was simply being present. Rosa slept in the next room, with that new peace that the right treatment had given her back. On the bedside table, the envelope with the confirmation. On the shelf, the 3 well-read books. On the windowsill, the plant that someone always watered with care. And throughout the house, there was something that could not be seen, but could be felt. The sense that the worst had passed. Not because life had suddenly become easy, not because the debts of history had been fully paid, because there are debts that cannot be paid with money or intention, only with time and consistency, but because the truths that needed to be spoken had finally been spoken. The people who needed to truly see each other had at last truly seen each other, and the hands that had been carrying a loan for too long finally had somewhere to rest. Sometimes that is all life needs. Not perfection, not something grand. Just the courage to step through someone's door, look honestly at what is on the other side, and choose to do things differently. Alexander Vidal learned that on a night when he stood outside a window, looking in at a house that was not his. Lucia learned that asking for help is not the end of dignity. It is the beginning of a larger one. Rosa already knew it. She had always known it. And Thomas, at 16 years old, writing a letter that would never be sent, was learning the hardest lesson of all. That carrying the past is not an obligation, it is a choice. And that at some point when a person is ready, it is possible to set it down, with care, breathe deeply, and walk forward with open hands. Because open hands are not empty hands. They are hands ready to build something new.